world. On behalf of Bond and the Partnering Initiative, welcome to the Challenges of Cross-Sector Partnering event, where we are now officially launching the Trends in Cross-Sector Partnering report for INGOs, which is here. We're really excited to share this report with you and to explore trends in partnering throughout this webinar. Thank you for joining this event at this time, and we hope that you and your loved ones are doing well during the ongoing global COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Gerard Witham, Head of Organisational Effectiveness at Bond, and it is my privilege to help host this event today alongside a great team. Everything other than the group work sessions from this event will be recorded and made available to participants afterwards. Partnering is all about relationships, where organisations, communities and individuals work collaboratively to deliver what they've agreed. I want to share 4 thoughts with you around partnering to help frame this event. Firstly, context. Partnering doesn't take place in a vacuum. Sustainable Development Goal 17 emphasises the importance of partnering to deliver the SDGs, as collaboration is key to poverty eradication. However, the current context is challenging. The global COVID-19 pandemic, UK and global funding challenges, localisation and #shift the power movements demanding people's rights to self-determination and decision-making within the communities are respected. The heightened sector scrutiny and accountability through the prominence of safeguarding issues and diversity issues such as those recently highlighted by Black Lives Matter, all demanding that we deliver everything but better. Secondly, the nature of partnerships. Partnerships range in nature from ad hoc collaboration to much more formalised cooperation. Partnering can take place between humanitarian and development actors, or be more cross-sectoral partnerships involving other actors, such as those from the private sector, to partner in new and different ways. Ideally, your level of investment in a partnership leads to shared outcomes, and for our sector means that those communities receive the support and resources they request in a timely way. Thirdly, partnering practice. Partnering experiences range across the spectrum of going really badly or going amazingly well. When I reflect on one partnership I inherited to build upon, an independent review concluded that after 15 years of programming and capacity development, no significant capacity building of that team or an organisation had really occurred, just some enhanced skills of 1 to 2 staff. Not a great foundation to build on from a partnership. But when I reflect on another partnership, we had the right people in the right place at the right time, and we partnered in an empowering, participatory, mutual and sensitive way, and the outcomes were amazing for that organisation and the communities they supported. For practitioners, it's important to reflect on partnerships, have greater humility, and learn lessons to inform better practice. And fourthly, desire to make a difference. It's not easy to partner well, and sometimes just because you're passionate and enthusiastic to partner, it may not actually be the right thing to do or the most sustainable option. Overall, we all want to partner well, realise real value from such partnerships, and ensure that our partnering makes more of a difference. The agenda for our webinar today is approximately 20 minutes, providing an overview presentation by one of the report authors on the trends in cross-sector partnering for INGOs. Around 40 minutes of interactive panel discussion with a great panel that we've lined up. 40 minutes for group work exploring one of 5 themes which you've signed up to in advance, and concluding with a short plenary sharing from each of the 5 groups and concluding remarks from Stephanie Draper, Bond's CEO. In terms of Zoom etiquette, please keep your microphones muted at this time, except for those presenting or panelists, and please use the chat function to chat as needed. Questions will be taken through Slido, which we will show you how to use. It's not essential to have your camera on until the group work time, or unless you're presenting or on the panel. The focus of this Trends in Cross-Sectoring Partnering for INGOs report is about getting under the skin of the trends we are experiencing in the sector, and we're pleased to be working in partnership with the Partnering Initiative, or TPI, for this report and event. Research for this report was conducted prior to COVID-19, and this pandemic context will interact with these trends, and you can explore what this means in your group work session later this morning, and I'm sure the panel will reflect on this too. I'm now delighted to introduce Ruth Findlay Brooks, Director of Research and Learning with the Partnering Initiative and co-researcher and author of the report from TPI, who will give a brief presentation on the report overview and findings. Ruth is joining us from France. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Jed, and thank you all so much for joining us for this exploration of partnering trends, challenges, opportunities. We're really sorry not to be meeting in person. We'd originally hoped this would be an in-person event, but like many things this year, plans have changed a little, and the upside of that is that I'm sure some of you who might not have made it to London will be able to join us online, so that's a good thing. I believe you've all received the link to the report that we'll be launching today, so I'm not going to go into huge detail. I hope if you haven't already read it, you'll do so afterwards, but just want to go through some of the kind of key points, the key trends, key messages that came out of it in order to kick off the discussion that we're going to be having, the panel discussion and the individual group work. So first I would say that my colleague Melissa and I, Melissa's also on this call, had really 27 very interesting conversations with people from all different sectors, different walks of life, partnership practitioners, donors. There's Mel popping up on the camera to say hi too. Yeah, donors, practitioners, trainers, all kinds of people. And we really appreciated the way that they were so open in sharing some of the challenges, their ideas, their thoughts, their interpretation of the way things might go and their ideas on what kind of support might be needed for partnering going forward. And you'll be hearing from some of those today. Some of them kindly joined to share their thoughts on the panel and others to join us in the general conversation. So make the most of that because there's some really interesting stuff coming out of it. The report itself was definitely a summary. There was a huge, rich range of ideas, thoughts and findings that came out of the research. But our original brief was to try and distill it down to 8 pages. I think we actually exceeded that a bit. We went to about 12 on the actual content, but it's very much a huge distillation of all that richness. And inevitably these slides are going to be a summary of that. So it is only going to be some of the key points, but hopefully at least some refreshers. And someone's actually asking in chat, if not already, if it's possible to share the link to the report in chat so that people can refer to it as we go along. I'm sure we can do that. So, okay, if we could start the slides, that would be great. Please do feel free to post questions in the chat as we go along. And I'll also leave a little bit of time for questions at the end, and there'll be a lot more opportunity to explore these issues during the rest of this session. Thanks, Lena, that's great. Lena's now posted the link if anybody wants to click on that. So what we did in this report was really to try to understand what the emerging trends are in cross-sector partnering and multi-stakeholder partnering, how organisations are responding to that, and the kinds of support that are needed. As I said, we talked to 27 people. We had 3 scoping interviews and then 24 main interviews and conversations. There was also a section on partnering in the wider Bond annual survey, membership survey, and alongside that we did some desk-based research. So as Jed mentioned, all of that took place around the end of 2019, so it was just before the world changed and the whole COVID crisis hit. And some people have said, well, are these trends still relevant? And the answer is absolutely yes. I think if anything more relevant, I'm sure that anyone involved in partnership, for example, the first trend we'll be looking at is localization. That's come, if anything, even more to the fore since the COVID crisis. I think, if anything, the trends represent interactive layers of complexity, and COVID-19, I'm sure most of you will have experienced, has added just another layer of complexity. So it's not a question of, normal and now we're not in normal, because as Greta Thunberg said, normal was a crisis anyway, and anyone working in development, working in the humanitarian sector will be very much aware of the fact that, we were dealing with crises anyway. This is another layer of crisis and another layer of complexity. So I think focusing on those trends that were there already is still very much a relevant thing to do. Okay, so if we could move on to the next slide, we will start to look at the trends. Thanks, Lena. Okay, so the first and overarching one really is localization. It's something that's familiar, I'm sure, to most of us. It's a major trend as donors increasingly provide funds at the national level. It's something that has been around for a little while, but is increasing, is accelerating, and as I said, has been very much brought to the fore, I think, by the current situation. The aims of the localization trend are supporting financial and program management capacity in country, trying to bring things closer to the areas of need, trying to sort of mitigate, offset the top-down model that's been a traditional way of sort of doing development and humanitarian support, and trying to make that more diverse and closer to the people who it's actually affecting, so that it becomes more creative, co-creative, sorry. The challenges are that, as we'll come on to very shortly on the next slide, there are very difficult interactions between that and the increased donor compliance requirements, which are also coming to the fore. And also because, well, yeah, it is a challenge for INGOs in that it really does potentially change the role of INGOs. It challenges the role. And that's something we'll be coming back to again when we look at some of the other trends. But the result is that some of the INGOs, as the funding is directed more in country, a number of them are redesignating their national offices as actually national organisations. Now, that isn't just a result of the localization drive. In many cases, it was happening anyway. And Oxfam, just to take one example, I think that, you know, well before that had already started to devolve the program management, and a number of other INGOs had as well. But this has really accelerated the process. And in some quarters, some of it is seen as a little bit cynical, that it's kind of, you know, putting a new label on a national office in order to be able to access the funding. But it's part of this broader pattern, and as I said, a number were doing that already. So just looking at how that impacts on power structures, how it impacts on this drive to shift the power is an interesting one. But it also is changing the role of in some cases, of the head offices of INGO, so that become more of sort of technical and fundraising support rather than programmatic, as the programming shifts into the countries. And yeah, it's also looking at, you know, what does this look like? As the quote on each slide, I've just put an example quote that somebody said during our conversations. You know, if we want to shift power dynamics, how do we do that? What does it look like? What does localization really mean? So, okay, thank you, Lena. Let's move on to the next slide, which is looking at these increasing compliance requirements. These were, as we all know, probably inevitable, and in many cases certainly desirable. The way that they've rolled out is problematic, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this. So the focus tends to be on financial management, on reporting, and on safeguarding. And all of these are definitely laudable and things that are really important. The challenges, however, are that the compliance requirements tend to be passed downstream, so that they can end up, the risk can end up with those least able to actually deal with it. And it is kind of undermining and making more complex the localization drive, because to partner with a local organization, a small local organization that is not set up in such a way as to be able to report in the way that's needed, doesn't have the kind of financial frameworks that are needed, where safeguarding is not something that's kind of consciously addressed. It's difficult, and what's happening is, in many cases, that either INGOs are spending a huge amount of time, and quotes, building the capacity of the local organisations to comply, or they're moving to working with bigger organisations who can actually already address this and have the frameworks in place. And where small local organisations are being built up in order to comply, that's not necessarily a positive thing, because it can make them very over-dependent on certain funding streams, because there tends not to be a great deal of continuity between the requirements from the different donors. And so a small organisation which was previously able to search for funding and support on its own becomes dependent on the particular donor that it's been empowered to, or its capacity has been built to comply with. So it can actually also interfere with the work that they're doing, because they're having to put so much time and staff time into the administration. So it's a difficult one. There isn't, there's more exploration of this in the report. There isn't an easy answer. This is not something that's going to roll back, but to look at things, for example, suggestions whether INGOs can try to take more of the risk on themselves rather than passing it downstream, whether donors can try to streamline their requirements to really look at ways that they can make it simpler. So yeah, let's move. Oh, and yeah, as the quote says, despite the grand bargain, which was the kickoff for the localization drive, or the main kickoff for it, in some ways it's harder than ever to partner as a national NGO. So, okay, next slide, Lena, please. Thank you. So looking at increased risks and pressure on NGOs and INGOs, as many of you will know, this is becoming a wider and wider issue for all different reasons, and different reasons within different kinds of countries. But in the middle income sector, low income countries, but even in high income countries, there's increasing pressure. There are new restrictive laws, new regulations, and in some cases even physical threats to silence it and intimidate staff in local organisations. So in many cases, or in some cases, INGOs are being driven out of the country, and there's increasing pressure on local NGOs. So it can make it very difficult for local NGOs to partner with international institutions. Those most at risk tend to be those challenging vested interests, those working on LGBT rights, for example, on gender issues, in some cases, in many cases actually, unfortunately, on environmental issues. They are the ones that can be really at risk, and it can be, for those partnering with the small organisations, can be quite a balance as to what extent to try to be supportive, to provide a kind of umbrella that perhaps some of these more controversial things can happen sort of underneath, or to what extent it's actually putting people at physical risk, and it's, you know, the only option is to withdraw. The plus side, though, is in some cases it's bringing out a greater diversity, because as the local NGOs or larger NGOs and the INGOs withdraw, this is actually creating space for grassroots organisations to move into, and they're actually starting to fill the gaps. So, for example, Pakistan was one of the examples that was shared on this, where the larger organisations are being squeezed, but the rural programme networks, the national networks, village associations are moving into that gap. But it is an ongoing issue and something that is becoming worse. And as we're aware, even with higher income countries, with populist governments, there can be a lot of pressure on things that are causes and partnerships that don't align with the sort of official, the way that the government wants to go. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Consortia and multilateral partnership approaches we'll be looking at in more detail in one of the breakout groups. But the drivers for this really are with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, issues are being perceived and acknowledged as being increasingly complex, increasingly interlinked and interdependent. And really it's only a multi-sector, a real genuine multi-sector approach that can deal with these. Alongside this, the formal consortium approach model is being pushed by a number of donors, including USAID and DFID, for example, and others. So the advantages of this kind of approach is that it does bring together complementary knowledge, skills and resources. There is this potential to take innovative approaches to bring together partners who are beyond the usual suspects, within these really quite diverse and complex groups, and therefore to tackle some of these intractable challenges that have not been that a sort of bilateral or single sector approaches have not been able to shift. The challenges are that inevitably there are high transaction costs. Setting up, the more complex a relationship is to set up, the longer it takes, the more the upfront input has to be. And so it can be further down the line before the impacts and the added value starts to be obvious. It can also risk being a bit more of the same, that it's just larger groups of the usual suspects and in fact reinforcing rather than challenging existing power structures. There is also this sort of risk that when there's a call for a consortium approach or a multi-sector approach, that organisations will get together just in order to get the funding. But increasingly, organisations are starting to look at sort of more strategic, long-term alliances, which will enable them then, when funding comes along, to say, okay, which is the right combination of partners from within this broad alliance to actually go for that funding, and that it is actually leading in the direction that they want to go. So overall, I think the trends are seen as positive, with an openness to work together and a realisation that cooperation and co-creation will take us further than competition. So yeah, it's the way the world is going. Okay, and next slide, please. Thank you. To add to this complexity, the changing funding mechanisms reflect the way the world is going. There's increasing competition for funding between NGOs. It can be more difficult to get funding, for example, from small donations. There is less non-designated funding available for all kinds of reasons. Traditional partnerships are becoming more difficult. So one of the responses to this is to turn to trusts and foundations who are becoming more involved in direct funding. There's also a real focus on efficiency and value for money, which is no bad thing, but also for NGOs to have to really be very clear about what their unique value is, what they're bringing to the table, because otherwise, particularly with the trusts and foundations, they can bypass the NGOs and actually fund directly in country as they seek to become more involved in what's happening, not just to be funding it. So the long-term trajectory on this really is increasing diversity, increasing complexity, and the sort of challenge to the traditional model. And I like the quote at the bottom that we're moving away, having to move away from egos, logos and silos, and to look at working together instead of competing. But in a world where funding becomes more scarce, that can be challenging. Okay, I'm going to move on a little more swiftly because I don't want to run over my time. We've got a lot of interesting people to hear from. So if we can take the next slide, that would be great. And the next slide is looking at the role of business, the way that the business is trying to become, or wanting to become, more of a partner in development and less of just a cash cow. It is bringing new innovative approaches, new opportunities to mainstream through linking into the market, but also brings risks of ensuring that interests really are aligned. And sometimes it's not obvious. Sometimes it can seem like there's a clash of interests and actually there isn't. But in other cases, it can be a case of, I don't know, what's the development equivalent of greenwashing, that, it is all about having a look on the right things. So trying to be clear about where interests are reflected and where they're not. And I know some NGOs have a sort of tradition of saying, well, we can't involve business if they are going to make a profit out of it. But after all, that's what business does. That's sustainability for business. If they're making a profit, but it's actually helping the cause, then yeah, that's a different way of looking at it. So that's it on the trends. It's a bit of a whistle-stop whiz between them, but we'll be hearing more about them as we come to the panel discussion. So if we can move on to the last slide, that would be great. I think there's one more. Oh, conclusions. Yeah, which I'll just go through very quickly. The trends, as I said, they're interacting in different contexts. The diversity and complexity of partnering is becoming increasingly interlinked, and as we find new alliances, new funding trajectories, There is great potential for innovation, but there are risks attached to this. And as I said, the COVID-19 crisis is likely to accelerate new and unexpected changes as these things interact. So genuine successful partnering will need equity, value, shared learning, flexibility, and the pursuit of excellence in partnering practice as we become more and more adept at negotiating these challenges. So thank you for listening, and I will hand back to Jed.
Okay, thank you so much, Ruth, for that and for giving us that overview and the insights and a quick summary on the trends in cross-sector in partnering for INGO's report. I think now we can say the report is officially launched. So we now move to the panel discussion, which will be chaired by Lucy Morris from the Partnership Approaches Bond Group. She's one of the co-chairs of that group and principal consultant at Intrack, who will lead us in this part of the event and introduce us to the panel. Over to you, Lucy.
Great, thanks very much, Jed. Thanks for your presentation, Ruth. That was really helpful. So, as Jed said, it's my pleasure to be chairing the panel discussion. And I'm really pleased to introduce 4 speakers representing different parts of the sector. So I'm going to introduce them each in turn now before we get into questions. So first up, I'd like to introduce Degan Ali, who's the Executive Director of Adesso. So Degan has an impressive track record of more than 20 years of hands-on experience in strategic planning, organisational development, programme management and business development strategies. Among other things, in 2003, Degan designed and oversaw the delivery of the first large-scale cash aid distribution in Africa, implemented by an NGO rather than a government agency. So under her leadership, Adesso's pioneered and championed market-based and dignified solutions to aid, globally allowing cash transfers to become a standard type of aid response. As many of you will know, Degan is a regular commentator on humanitarian action. She's not afraid to speak her mind when lives are at stake. And she speaks on a variety of issues such as localization of humanitarian aid, food security and security information, the Somalia famine response, cash programming, and the importance of supporting private sector-driven remittances. And most recently, Degan's been an active member of the Leadership Council for the Network of Empowered Aid Responses, or the NEAR network, that many of you will be familiar with. So that's a network of southern NGOs with a mission to reshape top-down humanitarian and development systems to one that's locally driven and owned. And Degan's calling in from Nairobi in Kenya, so welcome, Degan. Next, I'd like to introduce Katrina Dujon, who's the Director of Strategy and Impact at Tearfund. And previously, Katrina headed up Tearfund's Impact and Effectiveness team. So prior to this, she was a consultant in the social enterprise sector, and she provided advice to UK and international clients. And she's also worked for World Vision on development programs at strategy level, predominantly in Latin America. But she started her career with an environmental consultancy in the private sector. And she's also worked as a trustee for Cafe Direct Producers Foundation, which is now called Producers Direct, which is an award-winning fair trade enterprise led by farmers across East Africa and Latin America. And Katrina's calling in from Eastbourne in the UK, so welcome, Katrina. Thirdly, I'm pleased to welcome Hannah Clark, who's the Farmers Voice Radio Development Manager at the Lorna Young Foundation. So Hannah's an experienced international development program manager, fundraiser and bid writer. She's got over 14 years experience in the sector. And she spent the last few years supporting community radio projects in sub-Saharan Africa. So she's got an MSc in global health, and she's always very excited about the potential for using radio to inspire and galvanize people to improve their lives and communities. So her career started at Besso and VSO, and it was when she was working for CAFOD in the Brazilian Amazon that she first realized how powerful participatory media could be in enabling indigenous groups to protect their land. So Hannah then lived in rural Mozambique, where she managed a World Food Programme distribution and experienced firsthand the precarious situation of smallholders. And most recently, Hannah's worked at the faith-based radio development agency, FABER, managing projects in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and FABER's Ebola response in Sierra Leone. So Hannah has a proven track record in securing grants from large trusts and institutional donors, and she's calling in from Hove in the UK. So welcome, Hannah. And last but not least, I'm pleased to introduce Mike Babcock, who's the Civil Society Team Leader in the Inclusive Societies Department of DFID. And Mike's worked in the development sector for over 25 years, including over 15 years at DFID. So welcome, Mike, also calling in from the UK. So really pleased to have such an experienced panel. The way this is going to work is that we will be using Slido to collect your questions for the panelists. So if we can have the next slide with the Slido instructions so people can find them there. And we'll also pop the details into the chat. So if you go to slido.com and you enter this event number, then you'll have a chance to add your questions as we go, and it just makes it easier for us to pick them up. So you can either open in another browser on your computer or on your phone, and you can pose a question, which I'll ask on your behalf, but you can also like other people's questions. So if you like them, they'll go up the priority list. So I'll be inviting people to respond to your Slido questions after we've had an initial conversation. So I'm going to just ask a couple of questions myself first. And I'm also aware of time. I know we don't have much time. I want to respect the time that we have. So I'm going to keep the conversation moving. So apologies in advance if I either cut off speakers or if we don't have time to ask all of your questions. But let me kick off. So I guess the first question, now that we've had a chance to read the research report, we've also had a really excellent summary of the findings from Ruth. So my first question to the panelists is, what's the number one thing that's really standing out to you from the research findings? And I'll give each person a couple of minutes to respond. And I'd like to invite Dagan to respond to that question first. So over to you, Dagan.
Thank you all. Good morning, good afternoon. So yeah, I think the thing that stands out for me from the report that it's not so much about partnerships, but more really trying to grapple with what that future relationship looks like and what is the role of INGOs in humanitarian development action. And I think this kind of really existential threat that exists about the role of these actors, of international actors in a new ecosystem and what that looks like and what does it mean to be complementary, providing complementary support and not leading and being in the driver's seat. And I think that is really the framing of this, should be the framing of this discussion, rather than are we gonna just do some really small little tweaking on partnerships and the current subcontracting model of the relationships between INGOs and their local partners. I think ultimately, we're not really about trying to tweak things. We're trying to really shift fully the power dynamics. And for that to happen in a really an effective way, then it really means that there has to be a serious questioning about what value an INGO provides in this new system, in this new ecosystem, and what should that role be, and what should that footprint look like. And I think that's the real underlying question, I think, that is not really grappled with very often. And we kind of touch at it, but really don't really talk about it in a serious way, because it is so difficult and naturally very painful for people to really start questioning their future existence of these big INGO structures, that the model and the metrics of success has been completely geared towards more money, more fundraising. You as a CEO, your success is judged by how many countries you can plant your flag on, like a colonial style kind of system. So the more countries you are, the bigger budget you have, the more offices you have, the more staff you have, the more successful you are as an organization, as a CEO on a board. That metrics of success needs to be completely flipped. It should be about devolving power, devolving money, and really bringing the voice of local communities and local actors to the fore, and you taking a back seat. And I think that's the real issue at hand here, not really partnerships.
Thank you very much, Dagan. That's a cracking start to the conversation. So laying down the challenge about what is the role of INGOs and metrics of success. So thank you. So I'm going to pass to Mike Babcock now, also to ask Mike what was the main thing that stood out to you from this research, and if you want to respond to Dagan, feel free to.
Great, thank you. I found the most important finding was on multi-stakeholder approaches. The problems faced by the poorest are complex. As we have seen, the world is rapidly changing. Global challenges, those intractable challenges, are interconnected. No one development actor has the answers. We need new ideas, new approaches. We need creative ideas and innovation. And for that, we need to bring together different players, different actors, having unusual organizations involved, not just the usual suspects, creative, diverse. So bringing together the research organizations, private sector, think tanks, you name it, all of the different organizations, so that we have different ways of working that are complementary, but also different ways of working that aren't complementary, so that we're challenging each other's ways of working to break down the silos. And I love the phrase in the presentation of moving away from egos, logos, and silos. I'm going to steal that for a future reference. And that is the whole basis of what we've been doing on UK8 Connect, trying to bring together all these different organizations to really work on innovation and new ways of working. And we have set up a learning program which is going to be specifically looking at what we have learned on consortium and multi-stakeholder approaches. Great, thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Mike. So that stress on the multi-stakeholder approaches, which it sounds like DFID's already been investing in quite heavily. So thank you. So next, I'd like to pass to Hannah Clark. What was your number one takeaway, Hannah, from reading the research?
For me, the chapters that stood out were on the multi-stakeholder partnering, again, like Mike, and partnering with business, as this is something we are definitely seeing, and it's working for us and it's growing. So I manage Farmers Voice Radio, which is an initiative of the Lorna Young Foundation. We are very small and we're very specialised in what we do. And in the last few years, we have worked with a range of partners to deliver Farmers Voice radio projects within much larger projects and consortiums. We've worked with academia, with business, with national and local NGOs, cooperatives and certification bodies. And then there's us as a very small specialist NGO delivering quite a small part of those much bigger projects. And I believe this does result in creative working, as it says in the report, and the whole is definitely greater than the sum of the parts. But as the report said, it does take a long time to set up, and it is quite demanding in terms of coordination. Our partnerships with business are proving really valuable. For example, we're currently working with The Body Shop on a shea butter supply chain strengthening project in Ghana. And this is really positive, and it really is focused on strengthening the livelihood of the women producers at the start of the supply chain. And I could talk more about that if there's any questions. So we're a small organisation, but we're flexible and adaptable, which I think is really appreciated by other parts of the consortiums we're working with, particularly business and academia. We can move quickly and our processes are a lot less complex. But it's really important that we stay true to our unique selling point and don't stray from our remit. We greatly value to be able to contribute to these much bigger projects, and it's improved our reach and our impact, and it's given us a voice in previously inaccessible arenas. For example, we're working on a project, a climate change resilience project, with a range of different universities and NGOs, a massive cross-Africa project. And we've been able to be part of a video that's been made that's going to be shown to governments across Africa, to donors and policymakers. And we would have never have had that voice in that arena before. So these kind of partnerships are really working for us at the moment.
Great, thanks very much, Hannah. So really the power of the multi-stakeholder partnerships in allowing, I guess, things to be possible that wouldn't have been individually. So thank you. And last but not least, Katrina, what was your number one standout from the research?
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you for this opportunity to be on this panel. I think, picking up on what Degan said, I think this is a really critical juncture for the sector. I think as INGOs, we do need to be, looking deep, asking those very deep questions. And I think, as Ruth, you mentioned, these are many of the sort of themes that were emerging even before COVID-19, and it just feels that so much of it is so relevant, and if not more. We've seen this acceleration of many of the issues that have been raised in the report. And I think what really struck me is this sort of these tensions that were brought out in the report. The tension between the global and the local, that we do need to be working together, yet we need to have a very different way of working at the local level, or conversations around the shifting of the power. What does that really look like? Compliance and flexibility. We certainly have felt that pressure as an organisation of the heaviness of the compliance, yet the flexibility and the desire to work closely with our partners. Tearfund has been operating for 52 years, and we very much started from that partner model, working with local partners. So it's very much central to our DNA. But we've been learning over the years how to do that, learning how to work together with partners, learning how to work in movements as well. So really welcome this report, and think there's some really great deep kind of questions in here which we do need to grapple with, and I'm really encouraged that we have this space to do this.
Great, thanks very much. So it sounds like it, sort of also acknowledging, similar to Degan, that this is an important moment, and not to miss this opportunity to really grapple with some of those tensions. Thanks everyone. I'm going to ask one more question before we take a look at Slido and invite other questions in. And I'm sure those questions are going to touch on some of the challenges of partnering, which the report also touches on. But my question is really, what's making you feel hopeful right now when it comes to the future of cross-sector partnering? And Katrina, I'm going to invite you to respond first to that.
Thank you. So I think, picking up on what I just shared, I think for me, I'm really hopeful that there seems to be this change. There's the desire for different partnerships to come together, the creativity, the adaptations that we're seeing. And I think we've really seen that, with some of our local partners, with the movements that we work with, especially through COVID-19, this ability to shift very quickly. The ability to use digital and technology at this time as well. And I think that's something that we've, as we think about shifting power and balance and conversation and engagement, I think digital and technology has the power to really engage, but obviously we've got to recognise it could have the power to exclude. I think what we are really seeing, and we're really encouraged by, is that shift to more what we're calling catalytic ways of working. This ability to work with movements, so the more messy kind of ways of working, so less linear, less kind of traditional project focus, catalysing change makers. For example, we have a programme called Inspired Individuals, which is working with social entrepreneurs, change agents across the world, and seeing the power of individuals change in, within their communities, within their nations. So what is our role then within that? As an international NGO, how do we help catalyse, from a global perspective, and work very, very closely with those catalysers in the countries in which we work? So really encouraged by that, and also by the advocacy and influencing kind of opportunities here. This needs to be flexible, they need to be agile, they need to really be able to use influencing and use and shift the balance of power and conversation. So yeah, I'm hopeful, and we've got some great examples of where we've worked in partnership. One being a recent one called Bridge Builders in South Sudan, where we worked with Tearfund Belgium, REDAR, the Joint Learning Initiative, and Academic Research Network, Islamic Relief, to look at the role of faith leaders in humanitarian response. So there are some really interesting models out there, I think. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to learn. And yeah, once again, I think the ability to be creative, the ability to be adaptive is something that is critical for all of us at this time.
Great, thanks very much. Hannah, I'd like to turn to you now. What's making you feel hopeful when it comes to the future of cross-sector partnering?
I think much like Katrina, this area of increased localization and increasingly remote collaboration, which we've seen rise in importance during COVID-19, and just looking at how we can deliver services without being there physically. And I believe this could lead to a rebalance of power to local partners and local communities, and this is what's making me hopeful. As a small NGO with very limited capacity, we've been moving in the direction of increased remote collaboration for some time. We have been what we call open sourcing, Farmers Voice Radio approach. We've been giving away our methodology and expertise for free online, and we're seeking to do more of this. We're developing this more and providing remote support to partners to deliver radio projects themselves in their own communities that they set up themselves. And the lockdown has forced us to accelerate this work. And in fact, just in March, we launched a new DFID funded project in Sierra Leone through a remote training and setup workshop, and with a lot of remote support with our local partner. And this is what we want to do more of. This is where we see our direction of travel. And I'm really hopeful because I believe this is the way, this way of working puts more emphasis on the local partner and really building their capacity to deliver. And it moves away from a culture of dependence, and it makes us better at what we do as well. We have to provide partners with the tools that they need, and it might not get implemented in quite the same way as we would have done it, but it will be more meaningful and effective for that context. And the skills, the knowledge and control have to be transferred. And this involves two-way communication, and it involves trust, which I believe will build more sustainable and more effective partnerships in the long term. And for this, what do you need? You need technology. In our case, all that was required was Wi-Fi and Skype. It wasn't sophisticated. And it needs a good network of reliable partners and associates there in that context. I think it will be really interesting to see how this develops, particularly with regards to due diligence and compliance, monitoring and evaluation and accountability, as I believe this will have to change too. How we work will have to change, particularly if people can't travel, if people can't be there physically from the INGOs in those communities. So it'll be interesting to see how this moves forward.
Thanks, Hannah. So really seeing I guess the benefits of the current situation and the opportunities that's bringing. Thank you. Mike, over to you. What's making you feel hopeful when it comes to the future of cross-sector partnering?
I'm very optimistic on many of the areas that have been highlighted in the report. On multi-stakeholder approaches, I'm very optimistic because of the commitment from both civil society and donors to work on multi-stakeholder approaches. I mean, in respect to DFID, we've committed to UKAid Connect £130 million over 4 years. So there is a real strong commitment to work on multi-stakeholder approaches and to learn from them. And there has been real buy-in from the policy teams across DFID that are working on the different areas. On localization, there's just been a steady interest and commitment to working on localization. I mean, I've worked in development for actually more than 30 years. And when I started, it was all through UK-based civil society organizations. But since then, it's been steadily changing. And I joined DFID nearly 20 years ago. And over those years, we've opened up most of the funding schemes to Southern organizations. And now with the Grand Bargain, there is a much greater commitment to really take localization seriously. And finally, the civic space. I mean, the situation over the last 9 years has been difficult. The situation has got worse. However, if you look on a kind of a 30-year scale, there have been improvements in the access to information, transparency, And the future, I am optimistic because of the technology, because of digital approaches. There are ways, and it was just mentioned, remote collaboration, rebalancing the power. There are real opportunities that can be used now to actually try and build and strengthen and protect that civic space. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. So really seeing the opportunity and the commitment from the UK government and from the policy team there as well. So finally, I'd like to turn to Dagan. Dagan, what's making you feel hopeful when it comes to the future of cross-sector partnering?
Yeah, so I'm glad to actually have heard and been after Mark, because a lot of the things that you've just mentioned that DFID is doing is really it's a major, I think, steps in the right direction. I guess having been in this business for over 20 years now and seeing that we've been banging our heads against the wall, the fact that there is this watershed moment that we are at, I think, and these discussions that we are having open conversations about decolonizing aid, about racism in aid, about all of these things that were pretty much taboo subjects in the past. So we never really thought that we had such problems or such issues. I don't know why, but there was this naivete, and frankly, I think just burying our heads in the sand in the system, primarily by our white colleagues. So I think that we're having those discussions is what's giving me hope. What I'm worried about, and as I've said in the past, is that we really don't turn these discussions into any kind of serious, concrete action on the ground. I think we can talk about all of these issues, and it's not just a simple matter of lexicon or nomenclature or anything like that, but it has to be real systems change, and it has to translate into serious power dynamics at the community level, between local organizations, INGOs, removing all the layers of intermediaries so that we have a direct relationship and partnership with the likes of DFIDs and USAID. There's so many elements of the problem. So I'm hopeful that we're here, that we're having this discussion. We're talking about things that we couldn't talk about just even a year ago, let alone 5 years ago. But I'm also kind of worried that it just becomes rhetoric and it continues again for another 5 years.
Thanks, Dagan. And I think, helpful to get your perspective and to hear there is that sense of optimism, but also concern that we may miss also this opportunity if we don't really grab it and tackle it and have the hard conversation. So thank you. So now I'd like to open up the Slido. So Lena, if you can open the Slido on the screen and see what questions have been coming in and collect some of those from participants. I don't have that open, so I'm relying on you. Okay, so most popular questions. So on the whole, we talk about partnerships from the perspective of UK INGOs. How can we make sure that partners are feeding into what we think our role should be? So that's a great question. So I'm going to open that up to the panel. Whoever feels like they want to tackle that one first, please do step in. How can we make sure that partners are feeding into what we think our role should be?
Well, I'll try to take a stab at that. I've had some really interesting conversations with few INGOs, one being Safer World UK in the past. I think this kind of questioning really needs to start at the top leadership. I think there has to be serious internal reflection and desire for major strategic shift and the courage to really think critically about this and your role as an INGO, and it has to start at the board and the CEO level. I don't think this is a process that can only be, it can be championed by the staff, but it really has to start at the top leadership. And oftentimes my experience has been is that you have a lot of staff at the field or mid-level who are dissatisfied, who are crying for change, but the top leadership and the board is not listening. So I really think it has to be a two-way process that feeds into each other. And so that's one. And I think secondly, it's really having a a really honest, maybe anonymous conversations with partners, trying to ensure that there is no repercussions, because the partners on the ground are really very scared to tell the truth. You know, there's very few partners that will say to Save the Children or Oxfam, you know, you've been quote unquote capacity developing us for 10 years. At what point are you going to graduate us out of this relationship and get us to the level where we can actually now get direct DFID funding? That kind of challenge is rarely posed to these INGOs. So I think they have to really have these kinds of honest conversations where the partners don't feel like they will be penalized, because I have been in those situations where I've been seen as a troublemaking partner and that resulted in some consequences to funding. So the system does not incentivize challenging and questioning. It doesn't create incentives for people to do that. The system actually does everything possible to quelch new thinking, new ideas, challenge, and all of this. So I think we have to figure out how to really be more courageous and allow for more courageous voices to come through. And that's a challenge for INGOs to figure out how to have those conversations.
Thanks very much, Dagen. I'm really hearing, I guess, the importance of having safe spaces to have those conversations and you know, to be inviting and expecting challenge, but also the need to, you know, to be having those conversations at the top level of organisations. Thank you. Anyone else on the panel like to respond to that one? Katrina.
If I can respond. So I think some of the ways that we engage with partners around this, and in particular around sort of strategy, is including them in the co-creation of country strategies. So we intentionally will bring partners into those conversations with our teams, with other stakeholders within countries. So use our strategy processes as a way of engaging, a way of understanding the roles on all sides, and really looking at co-creation of strategic objectives together. So we found that works really well, certainly with our partners. And we also have various mechanisms set up to get frequent partner feedback. And yeah, obviously, you know, that may not always be as open, but we certainly do feel that we get a good level of openness from partners. And I guess some of the long-term relationships we have with partners, there's good connections, good relational aspects to our work with partners. So I think, you know, there's always room for improvement, and probably more spaces that we could be having to open up conversation. But, you know, we certainly have, you know, tried to put those various mechanisms in place to have that engagement and co-creation.
Thanks very much. So the co-creation of the strategies, but also the more regular partner feedback mechanisms as being helpful. Anyone else on the panel like to add?
Hi, Lucy. I've just got a quick comment to make there. I think as a small NGO, I think we're in quite a different situation from possibly some of the others on the panel and some of the bigger INGOs, in that most of our projects are demand-led from partners in the field. So partners come to us asking to work with us, and I think that puts us in quite a good position to be able to set up our partnerships in a way that is how the partner would like it to be. If they don't like what we're offering, then they won't work with us, and they'll find another solution to the issues that they're facing. So being demand-led, I think just responds to that very well. However, we are finding that in working with local partners to get funding from institutional donors, due diligence processes place a massive strain on those relationships, and where partners will come to us asking to support them to develop Farmers Voice Radio projects and improve their engagement and communication with farmers and rural stakeholders, we're setting the partnership up on a great foundation, but then we come at them with all the due diligence requirements that are coming from our donors, and it puts local partners off, and it creates a lot of stress and can damage partnerships.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that too. But thank you. I think interesting point that for a smaller organisation, it can feel very different, and really being demand-led helps you be, I guess, more confident that you're feeding into what the role needs to be. Mike, anything from your side?
Yeah. A key question, and it hits a really important issue. And we recognise that it is absolutely essential to actually build up the relationship between the different organisations within the partnership, within the consortium. And for UKA Connect, we built in a 6 to 9 month kind of co-creation, design, development stage. And we thought that would actually be too long, which is why we had 6 to 9 months. But nearly all of the consortia said they needed that 9 months, because it is difficult to actually make sure you've got the relationships to be able to do that, to make sure that you do have the right ways of working between the different organizations. Yes, key question. Oh, and it was highlighted in the report as one of the key findings.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. So just aware of time, I think we can go till 10 past, so I'm going to chance it with a second question. So apologies if we don't get to your question, but the second one, which has gone right to the top of the list: how does Mike think that the merging of DFID with FCO will impact the localisation agenda and partnership working? Will the new department value it?
I don't really have an answer to the question, but we've been told that the new department is going to be a completely new department, bringing together the best of DFID and the best of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I personally feel that multi-stakeholder approaches are one of our key, exciting, new, effective ways of working. So I'm confident that we will be able to make the case and ensure that these approaches are supported within the new department.
Great, thanks, Mike. Hopefully that answers part of the question anyway. And so I've just got a note from Jed to say we can go till 11:15 if we need to. So that means we do have time for some more questions. So the next one is, on the whole, we talk about partnerships from the perspective of UK INGOs. Oh no, sorry, we've tackled that one. So next one is, why aren't we inviting our partners into these webinars and discussions? These spaces are where knowledge is created and shared. Why aren't our partners invited? I just want to, I guess, just to respond myself to that one. So for the Partnership Approaches group, we do encourage those members that attend the meetings to invite their partners to give space, also to partners to present. So that's one example of where that can happen. It doesn't always get taken up, which I think is interesting in itself. But I'll pass that across to the panel. So why aren't our partners invited more into these kinds of spaces? Mike, did you have?
We've started having meetings directly with the Southern organisations that we're working with. It is one of the aspects of COVID-19 that has brought interesting new ways of working. I mean, the opportunity to engage directly with Southern partners is much easier now.
And are those, just out of curiosity, are those conversations purely with the Southern organisations, or is it with all of the members of the consortia group?
It was with a range of Southern partners in general, not specifically UKA Connect.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So that's one example of where that is happening. Anyone else on the panel want to speak to that?
I think it would be fantastic, and it would be brilliant to have our partners involved in these discussions. I think there are logistical challenges with that to happen. I think time is a massive issue, particularly during COVID-19, because I think our local partners have been given the brunt of the work that now needs to happen on the ground, and people are, like many of us, just extremely busy trying to work out how they can deliver projects. But that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be invited, and I think there would be massive value to having our local partners involved in these discussions, and more intentionally asking them to contribute and be on panels would be a brilliant move.
Thanks very much, Anna. Anyone else got anything to add to that?
Just add, I mean, we also do lots of webinars and engagement points for partners and for staff, and have done a lot more of that, obviously, in the past few months with COVID-19. And I think, just to say, you know, even before coming onto this panel, I did ask whether I was the right person to be on the panel, or to invite someone from outside of the UK, or from our partner organisation.
Thank you very much. Anything you want to add, Dagan?
I'm sorry, Lucy, can you repeat the question? Sorry, yeah, I'm having kids issues here.
No problem. The question is, why aren't we inviting our partners into these webinars and discussions? These are spaces where knowledge is created and shared. Why aren't our partners invited?
I don't know. I mean, for me, I think it's because the partners are fairly invisible in the supply chain, unless at the northern level, unless there's an advocacy meeting or some kind of meeting, and you do bring in the tokenistic Global South organization to speak at these events. But otherwise, I think it's just never thought of. I don't think it's even something that many of them think through. I'm personally even questioning, you know, like, why aren't we even in this panel? Why aren't there more Global South organizations here? Why is it just me? And I think that it's just the way it's been done. It's kind of, it's embedded in the system to think this way, and I don't think too many people really question themselves and their actions and think, oh wait, is this the right way? I've been doing it forever, but is it the right thing to do? And I think that level of like pausing and putting brakes on our instinctual behavior is something that doesn't happen too often. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't surprise me. I've been seeing it for 20 years, so this is not unusual. Many of the partners don't, like in Somalia or Kenya, many of the partners don't meet DFID. They don't meet USAID. They're never brought into these conversations or design of programs, or when they're lobbying for funding and they're talking to a donor about why they need to do X, Y in a particular location. It's never, they don't even want the partners there oftentimes. And I think this is part of the maintaining the power, is that, you know, it's to, and the maintaining your value to that donor is making sure that you don't have that partner there, because you're now seen as something that has great value to the donor. You know, you're validating your role as an intermediary.
Thanks, Dagan. So I guess the census isn't new, and I guess what I'm hearing is that in some ways it's maybe unconscious, but in other ways it may be actually quite deliberate sometimes to I guess, yeah, to prevent partners from having a direct access potentially to donors, for example. I am going to be slightly break with convention and just see if Jed is happy to also respond to this, because I know that when we've organised meetings, we have wanted to have partners participate through Bond, but obviously meetings normally are just for Bond members. I think in the past when I worked at the Red Cross, we were able to bring in sister Red Cross organisations, but I guess a question for Bond, is there something Bond could do potentially to make it easier for partners to join in what's essentially a membership space? So I don't know, Jed, if you want to respond to that now, or maybe when we come to a close in a minute.
I could respond very quickly if that's all right, Lucy. I think from my side, there's no desire from a bond perspective to exclude partners. I think sometimes it's just around how to meaningfully arrange that and whether or not bond members are actually happy with us to go to their partners. So we obviously, in terms of being a membership organisation, partners, so members come directly to us and look to us for those, and access to their partners is another conversation, and we don't necessarily have direct access to their partners, for example. We always have to go through members. So it's always a desire that we want to do more of that. It's just about the practicalities of doing that. And as I think the panel has already highlighted, there's challenges of time and time zones and other commitments. And also, I think as Dagan pointed out as well, how honest will partners feel they can be when there's different people in the room. Sometimes there's a challenge. So finding ways to create those spaces and actually doing more of that, I think, is very much something that Bond would like to be doing.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Thanks, Jed. I know we're nearly out of time now, so I'm not going to take any more questions. Apologies, folks. But thanks very much to all of the panelists for your time and for your insights. I think the things that are standing out to me are particularly about the role of INGOs in humanitarian action, that this is a moment not to be missed, that we need to be having the difficult conversations at the highest levels. But also the optimism around multi-stakeholder approaches, and that really being something that's valued and as an important role for those going forward. So I am going to pass across to Jed, with thanks to Dagan, to Mike, to Hannah and to Katrina for their time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lucy, and thank you to all of the panelists as well. We're now going to move into our group work session time. You've all signed up to one of 5 groups in advance, and in these groups you're focused on partnering and reflecting on the trends in cross-sector and Partner for INGOs report and the panel discussion that we just had, but also in the thematic area that you're sort of meeting around. So you'll have around 30 minutes, so we'll come back together again at 11:45. And after that, we'll have a brief plenary session to conclude this event, led by Stephanie Draper, Bond's CEO. Each group has a facilitator and a note taker, and the group work discussions that you have will not be recorded, but notes will be taken from those. And when you come back together in the plenary, there's 3 key takeaways that will be shared by the note takers from each group. So please participate actively, and you're now being sent magically to your breakout rooms. Thank you.
Coming out. So we looked at the fact that the rapid partnering happened during COVID-19. What can we learn from that rapid partnering in terms of moving forward, and what needs to be in place to be able to partner more effectively and more quickly? And a number of issues came up that we need to have pre-positioning and networks of organizations already in place. We found that if you've got really good relationships already, it's then very easy to then build up new collaborations, new partnerships with existing relationships. So having multiple organizations pre-positioned, networks of organizations will be really helpful in the future. We then also had about the due diligence processes, what takes so long. 2 things: can organizations create more sort of staggered due diligence processes, so that you can be doing these month-long or 2-month-long due diligence processes at the same time as actually getting going in partnership. That was one thing. The other thing was around common standards for due diligence across different donors, so that actually an organization, a local partner can basically once a year have a tick for due diligence, and then anyone can then work with them without having to go through that process. Then we had around organizations need to have the leadership to really sort of drive a partnering approach, to put in place the processes and the culture and mindset for collaboration and for partnering as well. And we had a very interesting point about we need to be careful about sort of rapidly entering partnerships, when we need to also, of course, be thinking about how we then potentially exit partnerships, so that we are not potentially leaving our local partners high and dry once funding comes to an end. And I think that pretty much covers what we have. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Darian. There's a sort of real balance in terms of the groundwork you need to do in order to go fast in terms of relationships. So next up, civic space and partnering. Rowan or team?
I think that'll be me. I'm Ian de Villiers.
Ian, great.
We had 4 key things that we looked at in a wide-ranging discussion. The first was simply just going back to the need for solidarity, support and voice, and really making a choice in all the complexities of working in this space, recognizing that there are a lot of kind of gravity factors that pull us away from this, to going back to that need. And then we explored these 3 areas. First, the heterogeneity of civil and, if you like, uncivil space. It's very complex. We need to be very, very wise about our engagements, and recognizing that engagements don't necessarily fit into a typical log frame in any kind of easy way. So a lot of wisdom needed about navigating that. Third, a huge opportunity around thinking about new technologies, around digital, particularly how we support, protect and strengthen. What are the learning gaps? What are our learning gaps in the aid and INGO sector so that we can do it? Maybe there are a lot of southern organisations and others that may be a lot better positioned. Our organisational cultures may not be good and nimble enough to do that alone, and recognising that, of course, as these things grow, then opportunities for bad behaviours by repressive and unhelpful forces are equally adapting as fast or faster than we can. And so then finally this key role for strengthening south-south, south-north-south learning, and making sure that we use what we can as fast as possible, because we know that other forces will use that as well.
Great, thanks, Ian. Really critical that we maintain that we show solidarity on civic space right now. Okay, next up is multi-stakeholder approaches to partnering.
Thanks. So yes, we looked at we only had time to concentrate on one question really, which was around whether or not multi-stakeholder partnerships and consortia have the potential to shift the power, or do they tend to reinforce existing power structures? So firstly, we kind of talked about who is actually and how are we defining what a more equitable system looks like, where power is shared more equally. Who is actually defining that? Then we talked about consortia and the risk that perhaps they're actually only allowing a cosmetic change, where organizations are kind of motivated by funding to come together, but they haven't actually made a change in their heart. And we talked a lot about the kind of structural problems that prevent the sort of sharing of power, and how consortia are often structured in quite a hierarchical way with different sort of tiers. And even the notion of capacity building and the kind of northern-based INGOs building the capacity of typically southern-based local or national NGOs, and that already kind of sets a dynamic of the INGO being the power holder. And one of the participants talked a bit about the kind of small programs approach, where multiple CSOs are funded, funding comes via their governments who distribute funding to them. And then the INGOs really have to kind of prove their added value and extra input. So that was our group.
Thanks, Anna. A big theme around power and that capacity building word. Changing funding mechanisms. If ever there was a power discussion, that will be one. So last but not least, let's hear from you.
Yeah, so that's me. So in our group, we spoke about the fact that often in funding and partnership building, creating the space to actively discuss partnerships and effectively building them can be difficult due to the lack of time and funding given to this. And that can lead to organisations going with partners that they may have already used or worked with for many years, given that they have already committed that time to building those relationships. But then we also had a counterpoint to that, breaking the cycle of how these funding mechanisms and partnership buildings are set up always kind of does tend to be met with these knee-jerk reactions from INGOs about the time and cost constraints, and it is important to challenge that point. And at this pivot point, INGOs do need to begin asking questions about their role, so kind of drawing on the conversations that we were having earlier in the panel discussion about their role in the funding process, and grappling with the potential of maybe removing themselves from the process and letting the on-the-ground partners have the opportunity to work independently, or instead becoming service providers to the on-the-ground partners in funding applications. And then we also spoke about the lack of unrestricted funding for organisations can sometimes mean that partnerships have become income driven and are therefore not focused on how best to effectively build relationships and to create impact. But then lastly, we did challenge ourselves to look at some positive examples of funding relationships with local partners. So a few of the examples given by those in the group were with the Australian Red Cross, Oxfam, Gates Foundation, Child Hope International, and South to South Consultancy.
Brilliant, thanks Laura. So thank you to all of you for feeding back so concisely. Do want to finish on the hour. There's so much I could say to sum up, but I think in essence what we are drawing out is that good partnerships are at the centre of the power pivot that's needed to get to better development outcomes. But we need the systems around them, the financing, the knowledge, material flows to work differently in order to make that happen. So we're going to continue these conversations. We have a partnership approaches working group, and Lucy and others are part of that, and they will continue to build resources and support and share learning based on their curiosity about how partnerships work. So that's a great place to go to continue that conversation. We'll also be, we are also looking at the bigger transitions that the sector needs to make, and we see shifting the power as central to that. So look out for conversations relating to that. And we are doing some work with DFID and TPI together, looking at learning from big multi-sector consortium partnerships, which is going to be incredibly insightful. Lena is going to share the feedback form on the chat function. We're very passionate about learning and would like to know what worked and what you would do differently. And we'll be writing up this webinar and putting that out on the Bond website. So in my last minute, just want to say massive thank you. Thank you to Ruth and Melissa from TPI, and to Michael at Bond for authoring the report, for authoring and editing the report, to the Bond Partnerships Approaches group and Bond members who've all fed in and shared their insights. And thank you today to Lucy Morris from Intrac, to Deegan, to Mike, Hannah, Katrina for speaking and sharing such great insights, to the group facilitators and note takers, to Lena and Jed for coordinating the overall event, and to DFID for funding the work through our UK Aid Connect grant. But of course, the main thing is thank you all for coming. It's been I think a really fruitful and insightful conversation in a really condensed period of time. So rapid sharing hopefully translates into rapid partnering going forward. So thank you for being here and let us know what you think. Thank you. On the hour.